If I asked you to describe your financial situation, could you accurately tell me where you are, what you have? Would you even be willing to? No matter what your situation is, I promise you, I've heard worse. I'm Sara McCullough, certified financial planner and certified divorce financial analyst, and I'm sharing some of the stories I've experienced over my career, taking those lessons and turning them into actionable steps for you to use. This is I've Heard Worse. In this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of a background framework that I run through when I'm doing a plan for a client. So when we're developing their plan, working through their questions, this is really my background organizing that I want to share with you in this episode. And so we're going to talk about several scenarios so you can see how they fit in. We're going to talk about how I organize things and develop a plan so that my clients have the information that they need to go ahead and make decisions. So we'll talk about one scenario that might be familiar to you. So growing family, wanting a bigger house. These were high-income parents, and the bank said, go for it. You're absolutely approved for a mortgage. But these parents thought, we also want other things. Other things are important to us. Yes, this house is very important to us. So are other things. We still want to be able to travel. We still want the ability to spend without worrying. We want to retire someday, and we want this to be our forever home. We're not really clear, though, on where our money is going now. And while the bank says we can afford the mortgage, we're not really sure what that means. That's starting to get a little worrisome now that we're looking at such a big transaction. And also, quite frankly, it's starting to get annoying because we're both really smart adults. So how come we're this confused about this area? And in our introduction meeting, these parents said, we really like the idea of getting outside help because we're tired of talking about this in our heads and just with each other because we can't figure it out. And if that scenario doesn't sound familiar to you, maybe these next couple will. Have you ever thought, how much can I spend in retirement? When can I retire if I'm sure I want to spend this much? Or how much do I need to save to do what I want in 5 years or 10 years or right now? Or how do I get a grip on what's happening every day, every month, every year? I don't really know where my money is going, and so I can't tell if I'm okay with it or not. And so I'm going to add a bit of a disclaimer in this episode that when you hear me talk about this framework, and you may hear me in some of the examples that I give you, I may talk about the solutions. I want you to remember those are the solutions that worked for those families. These episodes are designed to give you general financial information. This one in particular is giving you a look at what's going on inside my head, inside my office when I'm developing a plan. But it's so important that before you make decisions on your own situation, that you have your own personalized advice that lays out your current situations, your options, your risk zones. So that's my additional reminder that everybody's plan is going to be a little bit different because our situations and our solutions are unique. So let's talk a little bit more about this framework. I gave you some hints in that solution. The first question that we often have as clients is, what happens if I do this today? And in my example, this was buying a bigger house. That's the first question. The next question really is, if I do this today, if I buy that bigger house today, what happens tomorrow? Am I still going to be okay tomorrow? And any question that my clients ask me goes in one of those two buckets. That's how I sort questions, because your questions are either related to today, what if I do this today, what happens? And then the follow-up question, if I do it today or I don't do it today, what happens tomorrow? I need to see both of those things before I can make a decision. And so once you have answers in both of those buckets, you're going to be able to make a decision and you're going to be able to execute. It's these interconnections in our planning that really make us pause. And that's often where we get confused because we often only get answers in one bucket. Think about that family I talked about. The bank said the mortgage was affordable. They could go ahead and do this today. So there's the answer in the first bucket. Can they do it? Yes. But it didn't answer the question in their second bucket. What happens if we do it? If you think about traditional retirement projections, you're going to be fine. Look, here's a graph. You're going to be fine. For those clients, what's being answered is, look, everything's great tomorrow. But sometimes those clients are thinking, you don't really understand my today. And there's things I want to do between now and retirement that I think are going to change that graph that you just showed me, but you haven't even asked me about those. So those clients might have had their tomorrow question answered, but they didn't get today answered. So then tomorrow's not accurate. So then they just leave feeling confused. And that projection for them is meaningless because the two things are connected. And that's what financial planning should show you. So this two-bucket framework is built around answering your questions in both buckets, often in a very visual way. So it's simple and it's incredibly powerful because it's designed to show you the outcome of all of that stuff that you've been running around in your head. And that's important. I just told you why other approaches fail. The bank telling you it's affordable, the projection that says you'll be fine in retirement, because it's only answering questions in one of the buckets, not in both, and it didn't clearly draw the line. If you do this today, tomorrow looks like this. If you don't do it today, tomorrow looks like this, right? So you need answers in both buckets. And then if we go back a little bit and think about what do we see in the media, what advice do we get from the bank, from our advisors, it's often kind of one-line general information that we don't know how to calibrate it to us specifically, but we also don't know which bucket, if either bucket, it's answering. So we're recording towards the end of RSP season. And while RSP season isn't nearly what it was 20 years ago, it still is a thing. It is still an opportunity for institutions to advertise to you and remind you to get your RSP contribution done. But if you don't know how much you need to save, and if you have other things that you want to do, and your finances day to day right now are going fine, you might think, it's probably all going to work out. Things are fine now. My income's good. Maybe you have a growing business. I don't really see why I would do an RSP contribution, so I'm not going to. That was the strategy for two of my clients pre-planning. When they came to me, they weren't saving anything. In fact, they hadn't saved anything for years. They completely ignored the, hey, do you want to make a deposit phone call from their investment guy? And one of them was well aware of RSPs and some of the benefits that they provided because one of them was an accountant. So they filed tax returns and did tax planning for people, but they hadn't done their own RSPs for a very long time. And in fact, they didn't like RSPs. And so after our second planning meeting, I had answered the second bucket and the first bucket around, if you don't save any more money today, this is what your tomorrow looks like. And they didn't like that. And so within 4 weeks of our second meeting, they had opened TFSA accounts and they had made deposits to them. So they had started saving within 4 weeks of seeing the graph that said, Here's what happens if nothing changes. Here's what happens since you said you really hate RSPs. Here's a TFSA savings option for you, and here's what would happen. And they had done it. So they knew about the existence of both of these accounts. They knew about the features of the accounts, but they hadn't done it for themselves. Why? Because nobody ever answered the 2 buckets. They just said, put it in. And these clients said, no, thank you. The other 2 bucket question that came up was a big piece of this client's retirement plan before we developed their plan. Their story was they were going to downsize their house when the kids left. So as soon as the youngest was done high school, they were going to sell the house. It was too big for just the 2 of them, and they were going to downsize. And so I think by extension, they thought, well, then we'll get some money out of that. And so it doesn't matter that we're not saving right now because that's going to fill in the hole. If there is a hole, we don't even know there's a hole. But that should solve it. Downsizing, pre-retirement, seems like a solution. So again, in our second meeting, in the planning software, I showed them the graph where I sold the house, like they said, when their youngest finished high school. And one of them said, whoa, 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 what happened? I said, I sold the house, like you said. And they said, where are we living? And I said, well, we need to talk about that. Because if you're expecting that the house proceeds are going to provide enough for retirement, then we really need to talk about how that might be possible. And they were really distressed at this idea, even in the software, it was just in the software, of selling the house. And as it turned out, over a couple of more conversations, they didn't actually want to sell this house. And they really talked about it. There were things they didn't like about the house. And they looked at what else was available in their neighborhood. They talked about why they wanted to stay in that neighborhood. Like they really got into the weeds on what are we going to do here? Because very early in the planning, it was clear that selling this house was not actually an option. They didn't want it. As much as they said it over and over and over before they had done the plan, they didn't actually want to do that. And so for them, within 5 months of starting their planning, they had hired an architect and started plans on a massive renovation for the existing house. And so do you see that they didn't have actually either of their questions answered in the 2 buckets? They just had pulled a solution, will downsize, that they thought would work. But when we got down into it, if you sell the house on this date, your future looks like this. They didn't like it at all. They didn't want that. And so I'm so glad we had that conversation 15 years before they planned to retire and not at retirement, because that would have been a really different outcome. I don't know that there would have been room to do a renovation because they weren't saving. So these 2 buckets are incredibly important for a lot of reasons. Even if you're not asking the questions, I believe it's important as a planner that I prompt you to ask yourself the questions. What if you did this? You said you were going to sell. What if you sell? It looks like this. Where would you go? What does it look like today? What does it look like tomorrow? The other thing we get bombarded with in the media, common advice, common conversations, even casual conversations, how much do you need to retire? That comes up in my introduction calls all the time. I don't know how much I need. I don't know if I have enough. For sure, online nonsense in this category varies from a very small amount to a ridiculously large amount. So how do you decide what to do? How do you sort out what's where and why? Because what you need to know is how much do you need to save for how long so that you can spend how much for how long. And then look at what happens if investment markets freak out like they do on a regular basis. And so once you know how these things apply to you and what calculations are happening, then you can get on with it. But that's both buckets. Your plan needs to touch both buckets and give you answers in both buckets. Otherwise, you might be making choices that are actually driving you in a direction that you're not interested in. So I'm going to give you 2 examples that happen really easily when we're not using this 2-bucket framework. Often I find people can be working towards a goal that they don't actually want. So I find a lot of clients in their day-to-day financial behavior are actually doing things that are going to maximize their estate when that's actually not their goal. They have no desire to leave a large estate. But if they keep doing what they're doing, so first bucket, if you do this today, second bucket, your tomorrow looks like this. And without a plan, the clients don't see that. With a plan, I'm going to show them that, usually with a graph. And then they can say, that looks too big at the end. I don't want that. Well, then we can talk about how do we adjust that? What changes could we make? What other goals do they have? What opportunities do they have? What do they want to do today that they're not doing? Because now they can see, oh, we do have enough. In fact, we have too much. So that's the first thing that can happen, is that we're driving towards a goal that we actually don't want. We might actively not want it, or it might just be meaningless to us. The other thing we can do when we haven't used the 2-bucket framework, we might focus on paying down our mortgage rapidly, because that's good, right? Accelerated payments, all good. Bank tells you that all the time. Social media tells you that all the time. But what if you've accelerated payments on a house that you don't love, and it means that you're not doing other things today that you could be doing that are in fact more valuable to you than paying off your house rapidly? So we were driving towards a tomorrow goal in that situation that we actually don't want, or we wouldn't have chosen. And we didn't get the opportunity because the only information we have is accelerated payments means I will pay less interest on my mortgage over the life of the mortgage. Well, maybe that's not your goal. Maybe you have other goals. Maybe that one can just play out as intended, and you could do other things over the time of your mortgage. But again, without seeing that projected, you can't make an active choice, and you can't know by how much can I change these payments. What else do I want to do? What else would fit in if we just made regular mortgage payments? So how can I break this down a little bit more for you so that this is something that you can use in some of your financial decision making? So let's walk through an example. Step 1, you're going to think about something you want today. We're going to use a really easy example because this is a podcast, for heaven's sake. You want to buy a car. Possibly it's more than you've ever spent on a car. So your first step is today, so we're in the first bucket, today I want to buy a car for this much. Step 2, well, what does that mean? How much? Here's the purchase price. Is it a loan? Is it a lease? Am I paying cash? So step 2 is kind of looking at, how am I doing this? What are my options? Let's just look at options. What could I do? That's step 2. What are my options here? With a car, we're going to talk loan, lease, purchase. Step 3 is really step 3A, loan or lease. How much do I have available every month? Can I pay for a loan or a lease? Can I cover that cost without giving anything up? If not, what would I be willing to give up? Do I want to give it up? Okay, so that's step 3A, because we've gotten to method and amount of paying lease or loan. Step 3B, what if you were going to purchase outright? Maybe you have the cash in a savings account, in a TFSA, in a non-registered account. Maybe you do want to pay cash because you don't like monthly payments. If I let all of that cash go, how much would go? What else might I have planned to do with that money? Is there anything else that I needed to do or wanted to do? Right? So we're still in the today bucket. All of these things now are in the today bucket. And then step 4 is when we move into the tomorrow bucket. If I do this, what does it look like in the next 3 to 5 years for me? Are these payments going to interrupt anything else? Is there something else that isn't immediate, but it's coming and I'm not going to be happy, or I'm going to be pinched in year 6? If you're doing a purchase in cash, is there something coming up that, having bought the car outright, might leave me pinched again 3 to 5 to 6 years out, if not longer? This is a smaller example, so we're going to use a smaller timeline. So if you got stuck on any of those answers, this is what your financial planning is going to answer for you. Okay, but do you hear how we stayed in the first bucket for most of the steps, but we did move to the second bucket? Both of those things are important, because if you only stay in one bucket, you're going to tangle yourself up at some point, and you're going to be in a spot where you're thinking, I wish I hadn't have done that, or I wish I would have known before I did it, because I would have chosen differently. And so we can repeat this series of questions for a lot of things. Think about what it would sound like if you were contemplating a career change, right? Step 1, what is it going to cost? What do you know? What can you estimate about your earnings, your expenses? How much is available to cover that? What do I have right now? What would I need to earn immediately? Where's the loss? Am I willing to cut back in other things in an amount that it would make this career change possible? And if I do, step 4, what happens to my tomorrow? What is my estimated in this career change? What does it do to my tomorrow? So you can use those series for small purchases, medium purchases, big ones, big career changes. This works for the house purchase question, right? Again, the first 3 steps are today bucket. Step 4, tomorrow bucket. So that's my thinking when I'm developing a plan for clients. And I almost 100% of the time do more than one scenario. Because we come in as clients, we come in with our story. This is what I want. And as you saw from that one example, that was flat out not what they wanted. But until they saw it outside their own heads, they didn't know. So there's always variations. There's always scenarios. We always want to know, but what if this, but what if that, right? So I'm always doing more than one scenario. And so let's talk about another example of how does this really work in real life when there's a lot on the line. So for one of my clients, they were separating, and they came to me before they had met with any lawyers or mediators. They didn't know how they were going to separate. They did know that the marriage was over, and they thought they knew what they wanted. Mom wanted to keep the house. Dad was going to move out and live close. But what they said to me was, can you tell us if this is even financially possible? Because if it's not possible, then we're not going to pay lawyers to try to work this out for us. And so we looked at it. And when I looked at their numbers, what I ended up saying to Mom was, it is possible for you to keep the house in the separation. So that was her first bucket. Can I do this thing today? The answer for her was yes, you can. She would have had to buy out Dad. She would have taken on a bigger mortgage. Her income would have covered it. She would have been approved. And so from a today perspective, she could do it. From a family law perspective, yes. She could have made a reasonable equalization payment that the lawyers and the courts would have been satisfied that this was a fair agreement. So the answer in her today bucket was yes. The answer in her tomorrow bucket was a little bit different. And I was able to show her about 3 to 5 years out, this becomes unaffordable for you. So yes, you can keep it in the separation. You've got the numbers to get that. But ongoing, it's not affordable for you. And about 3 to 5 years from now, it is going to be unaffordable. You are likely to start taking on debt that you will not be able to pay off. So she was able to think about that. And with that information, she could make a much better decision on whether that's how she wanted the agreement to go. And if you're that person who needs to hear the end of the story, Mom did keep the house. Because what she said was, I don't think I can do another big change right now. I really want to stay in the house. I want the continuity for our child. That was important to both parents. And so she did decide to keep it. But she also knows where her risk zones are. And she knows this is probably not the forever home. And so she is planning to sell that home before their son starts school and then resettle then. And that is a reasonable decision to make. What I love about it is she was able to make it with enough information. Because sometimes what happens, in the same way that when a bank says the mortgage is affordable, we then think the whole house is affordable, and it might not be. When people negotiate a separation and one of them can keep the house in the family law discussion and their equalization payments are fair and equitable, they translate that through to affordable. And that's not always the same. So it's important that we do this 2 buckets, get the answers in both buckets, because then you can make decisions in your own best interest. Then you know where the markers are. Again, for this mom, she knew, okay, 3 years out, it's going to start getting a little hard. So she also knows if nothing has changed in my own income in 3 years, this is going to get hard. And it probably wasn't going to. Where she was career-wise was about her peak, right? So she knew these are my markers. This is what's going to start happening. And it's not a surprise. She can plan for it then. So that's important. So I want you to think through how this framework might work for you in your own situation, in any decisions that you have coming up. Do you have answers in both buckets? Do you have enough information in both buckets to make good decisions? I'm not recommending here that you have all of the technical knowledge to do all of the projections. That's certainly my job as a financial planner, and that may not be something you want to take on. I do have an awful lot of DIY clients who love spreadsheets and who have done their own projections, so they've got a sense. If that's your comfort zone, absolutely do it. If it's not your comfort zone, don't. Even my clients who do their own spreadsheets, who have their own projections, when they work with me, what they're doing is getting an objective second opinion. Am I correct in this assumption? Is my spreadsheet formula actually doing what it needs to do? What did your software do? What's the difference? What was I missing? What didn't I know to include? What didn't I know to plan for, account for, anticipate? So those things are all important. So can you DIY this? Maybe. Some of it, maybe. All of it? Hard to say. One of my clients that I've worked with over the last 7 years, this client drops in about every 2.5 years. So we did a lot of work on the foundation plan because there were a lot of changes in their life at that time. And now this one drops in about every 2.5 years. And they had just started their own business when we met 7 years ago. And a lot of their planning revolved around income projections for this business. They had their own assets. The business had high costs. And we did a lot of work around what income do you need to be making? What needs to land in your bank account that can be spent on your personal needs? At the beginning, the business was certainly pulling on this person's own assets. So it was running a deficit for sure. And so we did a lot of work around that. And the client came away from that planning with clear outlines of where the net income after expenses needed to be after 3 years, after 5 years, and after 8 years. And we talked about how much of their own assets could go into getting this business up and running. And at one of the update meetings, this client said to me, I still hear your voice in the back of my head telling me how much I need to be making. And I said, good. That's my goal. Because this client on their own can calibrate where they are. When they're reviewing their business numbers, they hear my voice in the back of their head. So they know over, under, where am I? And they know where they're headed. Remember that net worth episode? What you wish you learned in high school? This client knows where their net worth is going if their business is continuing to pull money instead of putting money back into the personal side. So they can track over time. They know which direction they're going. They drop in for updates on the amounts because they're not really a detail person in that area, but they know the direction immediately. And every time they make a decision on the business side, they understand the impact on the personal side. So there's no cloudiness. They can't pull the wool over their own eyes and say, well, it's a business expense, so it's not really the same as if I was, booking a trip to Antarctica. But it is the same as far as the numbers are concerned. And this client now knows that. So there's no fudging the impact on this client's today. And they are clear on whether they are borrowing from tomorrow or building up tomorrow. So there is value in working with an expert on this for a number of reasons. Technical knowledge is a big part of it, for sure. The other part of it is that objectivity. When it's your own stuff, you are very emotionally close to it, and it's very, very hard to come up with alternatives. It can be very, very hard to ask ourselves hard questions, especially about a business or something that we are really attached to, like maintaining a property, keeping a cottage, things like that. So that objectivity, I believe, is truly important. We have regulations for doctors about not having them treat their own families. And we don't have those regulations because we don't think they're good doctors, technically. They clearly are. But when it's family, your decision-making ability is clouded. And so I think at a certain point, if you are doing your own planning, having an objective person review, having a sounding board, having a second opinion, does this make sense to you? I think that's hugely valuable. But could you two-bucket on your own? I think if you've got an interest, I think you might be able to get yourself some or most of the way there. So let's talk about, if you're doing this on your own, where are the common pitfalls? I find it can be difficult for people to accurately anticipate their future spending. And this comes with practice. This comes with working with hundreds of clients over 20 years, kind of seeing a lot of different scenarios. So accurately anticipating future spending, possibly accurately sorting out current spending, that can be hard to do. And if you get either of those things wrong and what might change over time, it's going to blow your spreadsheet formula. Tax is another area that I find people have trouble with, especially over time. And the strategies to manage tax over time are not intuitive. So spoiler alert, tax management in retirement is not the same as when you're working and accumulating. To decumulate or spend your money well, you need to plan ahead of that. And the tax strategies are very much the opposite of common practices. So tax is a big one to your plan. That can have a six-figure effect over the lifetime of a plan. How different types of accounts work. We're often a little bit fuzzy there. And so if we've got spreadsheet projections, we can make some incorrect assumptions in there. So again, we're not calibrating our formula correctly to deal with how the accounts actually work. We're also not clear on how government pensions work. So that's another area that people are vastly confused. And so again, it can be hard to do your own projections or make your own assumptions when you are working with incorrect or incomplete information. And then again, the last one on my list here, I've already talked about a little bit. We rarely see our own situation clearly. And there can be so much value in having somebody else take a look at our situation. What I want from you to take from this episode is that if you feel like your questions haven't been answered, if you have an advisor and you've asked questions, but you feel like there's still something outstanding, it's probably because they only answered one bucket. So now you have the question to ask them, to prompt them, to give you the information in the other bucket. So maybe you've been told, don't worry, you'll retire fine. You can go back and say, I appreciate that you said this to me, but I'm not sure if I was clear that I also wanted to do this, this, and this before retirement. Could you just let me know what that looks like? Or you might have to say, I understand that you said I would be fine in retirement, but I actually also wanted to do this when I retire, which I'm not doing right now. Is that possible? Does that change anything for me? Right? So now that you understand the 2-bucket framework, I think it can give you a way to ask questions to get the information that you're looking for. But if you are more of a DIY person and you have been managing a lot of things on your own, absolutely know that advice-only planners can be that sounding board for you. I work with a lot of clients like that, where they say, this is what I want, this is what I'm targeting, this is what I think is possible, now you tell me what you think. And so that's really helpful for those people to go away with confirmation, new options, different ways to see things. And again, they've got the questions answered in both buckets, which allows them to make more confident decisions. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out the other episodes. There are 12 in this series, each one focusing on a different important aspect of financial planning. You can listen from start to finish, or pick and choose the episodes that matter most to you. Consider sharing an episode with someone else who needs to hear it. Thank you for liking and subscribing. And remember, no matter what you think of your financial situation, I've heard worse, which means you and I can make it better.